The galaxy ignored them. Then humanity stepped in. The Zephyrian merchant ship Stellar Wind drifted helplessly through the void, its engines silent and hull scarred by plasma burns. Captain Veltar pressed his four-fingered hand against the viewport, watching the distant stars with growing despair. 3 days had passed since the Korthak raiders had crippled his vessel, stealing his cargo and leaving his crew stranded in the Outer Rim territories. Any response to our distress calls? Veltar asked his communications officer, though he already knew the answer. Nothing, Captain. The Galactic Trade Federation says this sector is too dangerous for rescue operations. The Hegemony Council claims it's outside their jurisdiction. Even the Stellar Patrol won't venture here. The young Zephyrian's blue-scaled face showed the same hopelessness they all felt. Veltar's mandibles clicked in frustration. This was how it always went. The major galactic powers had divided the galaxy among themselves, carving up territories like a feast. But there were gaps between their domains, lawless regions where pirates and raiders thrived, where smaller species like his own were left to fend for themselves. The galaxy's great civilizations simply ignored these forgotten corners. The Korthak Dominion had been expanding aggressively for decades, enslaving weaker races and strip mining entire systems. Their latest campaign had pushed deep into neutral space, forcing hundreds of species from their homeworlds. Refugee ships crowded the shipping lanes, begging for sanctuary that never came. The galactic powers were too busy with their own politics to care about what they called minor species disputes. A soft chime from the sensor station broke Veltar's brooding. Captain, I'm detecting an unknown vessel approaching. Configuration doesn't match any ship in our databases. Veltar moved to look at the display. The approaching craft was sleek but small, clearly built for long-range travel rather than combat. Its hull was a matte gray-white, and strange markings covered its surface. Hail them, he ordered. The view screen flickered to life, revealing a bipedal creature unlike anything in the galactic registry. It had pale pink skin, short dark hair, and only 2 eyes positioned on the front of its head, a predator's configuration. When it spoke, the universal translator struggled with the alien syntax. This is Captain Sarah Chen of the human vessel Wanderer. We received your distress signal. Do you require assistance? Veltar stared at the strange being. Humans, he'd never heard of this species. You came to help us. We're in Korthak-controlled space. It's extremely dangerous. The human's face arranged itself in what the translator identified as a smile, so we noticed. We passed 3 of their patrol ships on the way here. They won't be bothering anyone for a while. You fought the Korthak? Alone? Veltar couldn't hide his amazement. The Korthak were known throughout the galaxy for their military might. Fought might be too strong a word. We convinced them to find somewhere else to be. Captain Chen's expression grew more serious. We can tow you to the nearest safe port, but I should warn you. We're not from around here. Just arrived in this part of the galaxy a few months ago. As the human ship maneuvered to attach towing cables, Veltar found himself studying these newcomers with growing fascination. Their technology was clearly advanced, yet they operated with only a small crew. Most remarkably, they had ventured into dangerous space to help complete strangers, asking nothing in return. During the journey to the trading station at Kepler's Rest, Captain Chen explained that humanity had recently developed faster-than-light travel and was exploring beyond their home system for the first time. They were still learning about galactic politics and the various species they encountered. We've been hearing stories about refugee camps and pirate raids, Chen said as they traveled. Seems like there's a lot of suffering in the outer regions while the major powers focus on their own territories. Veltar's mandibles drooped sadly. It has always been this way. The strong ignore the weak. The Galactic Trade Federation cares only about profit margins. The Hegemony Council concerns itself with maintaining the balance of power between major civilizations. Species like mine are too small to matter. That's unfortunate, Chen replied, her tone carrying an edge that made Veltar's scales tingle. Where we come from, we have a saying, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing. At Kepler's Rest, a ramshackle station built from salvaged ship parts and asteroid rock, Veltar witnessed something extraordinary. The human crew didn't simply drop off his ship and leave. Instead, they spent hours in the station's cantinas and trading posts, talking to other species, learning about the region's problems. Captain Chen seemed particularly interested in stories about Korthak raids and the refugee crisis. As the stellar wind underwent repairs, Veltar found himself dining with the humans, sharing stories about life in the Outer Rim. He told them about the sanctuary worlds, a small cluster of planets where various species had tried to establish safe havens for refugees. The Korthak had been systematically attacking these worlds, confident that no one would stop them. The galaxy has rules, Veltar explained. The major powers have agreed that certain regions are neutral zones, but they don't enforce their own treaties. They say it's too expensive to maintain peacekeeping forces in every system. So places like the sanctuary worlds are protected by law but not by action. Captain Chen exchanged glances with her officers. How many people live in these sanctuary worlds? Millions. Maybe tens of millions. Refugees from dozens of species, all seeking nothing more than a place to live in peace. Veltar's voice carried the weight of his people's suffering. The Korthak know we have nowhere else to go. They take their time raiding one world at a time, knowing no one will intervene. The next morning, as the stellar wind prepared to depart, Veltar was surprised to see the human ship powering up its engines as well. "Where are you headed, Captain Chen?" he asked over the comm. "We're going to take a look at these sanctuary worlds," she replied. "Someone needs to see what's happening there firsthand." Veltar felt a flutter of hope mixed with fear. "Captain, I must warn you again. The Korthak have an entire fleet operating in that region. They've defeated every force sent against them." Chen's smile appeared on the screen again, but this time it carried something that made Veltar's predator recognition instincts activate. "Captain Veltar, has anyone ever told you the story of David and Goliath?" As the human ship disappeared into hyperspace, Veltar realized that the galaxy was about to learn something new about this species called humanity. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope that someone might finally stand up for the forgotten corners of space. The galaxy ignored them. Then humanity stepped in. The refugee camp on Haven Prime stretched beyond the horizon, a sprawling collection of makeshift shelters housing the displaced and desperate. Elder Thys of the Arconian people stood at the edge of the settlement, her elongated limbs trembling as she watched the sky for signs of another Korthak raid. 3 attacks in the past month had left their defenses shattered and their hope nearly extinct. "Elder, there's a ship approaching," called Jorik, a young Mendi whose family had fled the mining worlds. "But it's not Korthak. The configuration is unknown." Thys activated her personal scanner, studying the approaching vessel. It was smaller than typical military craft, but something about its design spoke of advanced engineering. More importantly, it wasn't broadcasting Korthak identification codes. The ship landed in the designated area outside the camp, raising clouds of red dust. A group of beings emerged that Thys had never seen before, bipedal creatures with pale skin and an oddly symmetrical appearance. They moved with purpose but without the aggressive swagger typical of raiders or conquerors. The leader approached the camp's perimeter where Thys waited with the other elders. Through the universal translator, she introduced herself as Captain Sarah Chen of something called the Human Exploration Fleet. Her manner was formal but respectful. "We've been investigating reports of attacks on civilian populations in this region," Captain Chen said. "We'd like to speak with your leadership about the situation here." Thys felt a bitter laugh escape her throat. "Are you journalists? Another species come to document our suffering for the galaxy's entertainment? Or perhaps you're advanced scouts for someone looking to claim salvage rights after we're all dead?" The human's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes reminded Thys of old hunters, patient predators who could wait as long as necessary for the right moment. "Neither, Elder. We're here to understand what's happening and possibly to help." Over the next several hours, Thys found herself telling the humans stories she'd shared with countless officials, aid workers, and supposed peacekeepers. She explained how the sanctuary worlds had been established as neutral territory, protected by galactic law, but ignored by galactic enforcement. She described the systematic Korthak campaigns that had destroyed entire settlements while the major powers looked the other way. "We filed formal complaints with every galactic authority," Thys said as they walked through the camp. Around them, children of a dozen species played together, while their parents worked to maintain some semblance of normal life. "The Galactic Trade Federation says the attacks don't significantly impact commerce routes. The Hegemony Council claims the Korthak have legitimate territorial claims. Everyone has excuses," Captain Chen stopped walking and knelt beside a group of Veltani children who were drawing in the dirt with sticks. The young ones gathered around her curiously, chattering in their native language. Without needing translation, she smiled and showed them how to draw simple geometric shapes. "What's the Korthak military strength in this region?" she asked quietly, still playing with the children. "Substantial. 3 heavy cruisers, dozens of raiders, and a forward base on the moon of Kepler 7. They've been systematically destroying our defensive capabilities, taking what they want and leaving us to slowly starve." These couldn't keep the despair from her voice. Elder Korvac of New Andoria estimates they could eliminate all 7 sanctuary worlds within the next year, if no one intervenes. The human looked up from the children, and Thys saw something in her expression that made her step back instinctively. For just a moment, Captain Chen's friendly demeanor had fallen away, revealing something far more dangerous underneath. "Have you considered evacuation?" Chen asked, standing and brushing dust from her uniform. "Where would we go? The established worlds won't accept refugees in these numbers. The major powers have their own problems. We're trapped here, and the Korthak know it." Thys gestured toward the vast camp around them. "This isn't just a settlement, Captain. It's a repository for every species the galaxy has forgotten." That evening, Thys joined the human crew for a meal prepared from their ship's supplies. The food was simple but nutritious, and she was surprised by how the humans insisted on sharing it freely with any camp residents who approached. Most visiting species maintained strict protocols about resource sharing. During the meal, Captain Chen's communications officer approached with what appeared to be an urgent message. Thys couldn't understand the human language, but she recognized the tension that immediately filled the conversation. "What is it?" Thys asked. "Long-range sensors detect a Korthak fleet approaching this system. 12 vessels, including what appears to be a Dreadnought-class ship. They'll be here within 6 hours." Thys felt her heart stop. A Dreadnought meant this wasn't another raid, it was a final assault. The Korthak were coming to end the sanctuary worlds once and for all. "We need to evacuate immediately," she said, already mentally calculating logistics. If we can get the children and elderly to the deep caves, some might survive the bombardment. But Captain Chen was shaking her head. "Elder Thys, how many people are in this camp?" "Nearly 50,000 across all 7 settlements on this world. And how many transport vessels do you have?" Thys's mandibles drooped. "Perhaps a dozen small craft. Maybe enough to evacuate 1,000 people if we're lucky." The human crew exchanged looks that spoke of rapid calculations and difficult decisions. Finally, Captain Chen stood and activated her communicator. "Wanderer to Fleet Command. Priority 1 transmission." A voice crackled back in the human language, and Thys listened to an intense conversation that lasted several minutes. She caught references to coordinates, fleet positions, and something called Protocol 7. When Captain Chen finished the call, she turned back to Thys with an expression that was somehow both apologetic and determined. "Elder, I need to ask you to trust me. Gather your people and have them ready to move quickly when I give the signal. Don't pack anything you can't carry. Just be ready. Move where?" "Captain, there's nowhere to run from a dreadnought bombardment." The human smile returned, but now Thys could see it was the expression of a predator preparing to hunt. "Elder, you mentioned that the galaxy has forgotten about you. Well, the galaxy is about to remember that humanity doesn't forget our friends." As alarms began sounding across the camp, signaling the approach of the Korthak fleet, Thys watched the humans calmly preparing their small ship for departure. She realized that despite their friendly demeanor and apparent concern for refugees, these beings were nothing like the soft diplomats and bureaucrats she dealt with before. Whatever was about to happen, she suspected the Korthak were about to learn that some species should not be underestimated. The sky began to fill with the ominous shapes of approaching warships. But for the first time in months, Elder Thys wasn't afraid. Something told her the galaxy's balance of power was about to shift, and humanity was going to be the catalyst. The galaxy ignored them. Then humanity stepped and Admiral Krekthar stood on the bridge of the dreadnought Death's Talon, watching the pathetic refugee settlement grow larger on his tactical display. This would be the final blow to the so-called sanctuary worlds, ending years of what the Korthak High Command considered an embarrassing persistence by inferior species. "Battle Group 7 is in position around the outer planets," reported his tactical officer, a scarred veteran of dozens of such operations. "Ground assault forces are ready for deployment. The aliens have nowhere to run. Krekthar's mandibles clicked with satisfaction. The Korthak Empire had built its reputation on the simple principle that might makes right. These refugee populations had served as useful testing grounds for new weapons and tactics. But the High Command had grown tired of the ongoing operations. It was time to clear the sector completely. Begin orbital bombardment of military targets, Krekthar ordered. Spare the settlements for now. I want the civilians to see their defenses crumble before we take them. The first wave of plasma fire lit up Haven Prime's sky, reducing the settlement's small defensive stations to molten slag. Krekthar expected to see the usual panic and chaos. The desperate evacuation attempts that always preceded final conquest. Instead, something unexpected appeared on his sensors. Admiral, detecting multiple hyperspace signatures inbound. Unknown vessels approaching at high velocity. Krekthar frowned. Intelligence had assured him that no major galactic power would interfere with this operation. The Trade Federation, Hegemony Council, and Stellar Dominion had all tacitly agreed to let the Korthak handle the refugee problem. Display the new contacts. The tactical screen lit up with dozens of red markers, ships emerging from hyperspace in perfect formation around his fleet. But these weren't the massive capital ships typical of galactic powers. They were sleek, predatory-looking vessels that moved with unusual coordination. Sir, we're receiving a transmission. Audio only. Put it through. A voice spoke in heavily accented galactic standard. Korthak Fleet, this is Admiral Rebecca Torres of the Human Defense Coalition. You are ordered to cease hostilities against the civilian population and withdraw from this system immediately. Krekthar's laughter echoed across the bridge. Humans? He'd never heard of this species, but their audacity was impressive. Unknown vessels, you are interfering with a legitimate military operation in Korthak space. Withdraw immediately or be destroyed. Admiral Krekthar, the human voice replied, somehow knowing his name. Let me be very clear. You have 30 seconds to begin withdrawal, or we will interpret your presence as an act of war against humanity and our allies. The Admiral's amusement turned to irritation. These aliens clearly didn't understand the balance of power in this region. All ships target the unknown vessels. Let's teach these, newcomers about Korthak superiority. What happened next would be discussed in military academies across the galaxy for generations to come. The human ships moved like nothing Krekthar had ever seen. They didn't maneuver like typical spacecraft. They flowed through space like living things, seeming to anticipate his tactical decisions before he made them. Their weapons were precise and devastatingly effective, targeting shield generators and engine systems with surgical accuracy. Within minutes, half his fleet was disabled. The humans weren't trying to destroy his ships. They were systematically crippling them, removing their ability to fight or flee while keeping their life support intact. How are they doing this? Krekthar demanded as another cruiser went dark. Our shields should be impervious to their weapons. His tactical officer's face had gone pale. Sir, they're not using energy weapons at all. These appear to be some kind of kinetic projectiles, but they're moving at significant fractions of light speed. They're punching through our shields like they don't exist. The Death's Talon shuddered as something impacted their primary engine assembly. Damage reports flooded in from across the ship, but somehow their life support and bridge remained untouched. Admiral, came the human voice again, this is your final warning. Surrender now, or we will escalate our response. Krekthar's pride warred with his growing fear. The Korthak Empire didn't surrender. But as he watched his supposedly invincible fleet being methodically dismantled by an unknown enemy, he began to understand that his choices were rapidly narrowing. Sir, we're detecting massive energy buildups from the human ships, his sensor operator reported. Whatever they're charging, it's unlike anything in our databases. On the tactical display, Krekthar watched as the human fleet repositioned itself. But instead of preparing for another attack on his ships, they were aiming at something else entirely. The first shot turned a small asteroid into vapor. The second carved a perfect sphere out of Haven Prime's larger moon. The third created a brief artificial star that lit up the entire system. The implications hit Krekthar like a physical blow. These weren't ship-to-ship weapons. These were planet killers, weapons capable of sterilizing entire worlds. And the humans had just demonstrated that they could use them with pinpoint accuracy. Admiral Torres, he said, his voice carefully controlled. The Korthak Empire requests clarification of your terms. Simple, Admiral. You will order your entire fleet to stand down. Your crews will transfer to the damaged vessel's life pods, which we will tow to the nearest Korthak military base. Your ships will be turned over to the refugee populations as compensation for the attacks they've endured. Krekthar's mandibles clicked in outrage. You cannot seriously expect us to surrender our entire fleet. Admiral, let me explain something about human nature. We have a particular hatred for bullies, and we have a saying, never start a fight you can't finish. You started this fight when you attacked civilians. We're finishing it. Around the bridge, Krekthar's officers stared at their displays in growing horror. The human fleet had spread out to cover every possible escape route. More ships were arriving through hyperspace with each passing minute. What had begun as a simple pacification operation was turning into a complete disaster. Sir, his communications officer whispered, we're receiving reports from across the sector. Human fleets have appeared at every Korthak installation simultaneously. They're demanding the same thing, complete withdrawal from the sanctuary worlds and reparations for the refugee populations. Krekthar realized with growing dread that this wasn't a local conflict. This was a coordinated military operation on a scale that suggested these humans had been planning and preparing for months. Somehow a species no one had heard of had managed to outmaneuver the entire Korthak military hierarchy. Admiral Torres, he said finally, the Korthak Empire accepts your terms. As his proud fleet began the humiliating process of surrender, Krekthar couldn't help but wonder how the galaxy's established powers would react when they learned that a new player had entered the game. A player that seemed to care more about protecting the weak than maintaining the status quo. He suspected the major galactic civilizations were about to receive a very uncomfortable education about human values. The galaxy ignored them. Then humanity stepped in. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened in the towering crystal halls of Nexus Prime, where representatives from the galaxy's major powers had gathered for centuries to maintain the delicate balance of interstellar politics. Today, however, the usual calm deliberation was replaced by barely controlled panic. Ambassador Zethkri of the Hegemony Council stood at the central podium, his crystalline form refracting the chamber's lights into nervous patterns. Fellow delegates, we face an unprecedented crisis. In less than 72 hours, an unknown species calling themselves humans has completely dismantled Korthak military operations across 7 sectors. Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the assembly. The Korthak Dominion had been one of the galaxy's rising powers, their military expansion carefully balanced against the interests of the established civilizations. Their sudden defeat seemed impossible. Where did these humans come from? Demanded Director Valesh of the Galactic Trade Federation, her tentacles writhing with agitation. Our intelligence networks monitor every emerging civilization. How did an entire military force develop without our knowledge? Prime Minister Jorath of the Stellar Dominion consulted his holographic display. Our analysts are still studying the combat recordings, but initial assessments suggest technological capabilities that exceed our own in several key areas. Their ships appear to use some form of exotic matter propulsion, and their weapon systems demonstrate energy manipulation we don't fully understand. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. For millennia, the galaxy's major powers had maintained their positions through careful management of technological advancement. The appearance of a species with superior capabilities threatened to upset everything. There's something else, Zethkri continued. According to refugee witnesses, the humans claim they arrived in this galaxy only months ago. They describe their intervention as a matter of principle, protecting civilian populations from what they termed unacceptable aggression. Director Valesh's color shifted to an alarmed purple. Are you suggesting they're not originally from this galaxy? That there's some form of extragalactic power? The evidence points in that direction. More concerning is their apparent indifference to our established territorial agreements. They've made no attempt to claim the systems they've liberated, instead turning control over to the refugee populations. This revelation sent another wave of unease through the assembly. Galactic politics operated on the principle that every action had a territorial or economic motive. A power that acted without seeking expansion or profit was an unknown quantity that couldn't be predicted or controlled. What of the Korthak response? Asked Senator Thylin of the Outer Rim Alliance. Complete capitulation. Admiral Krekthar's entire fleet surrendered without destroying a single human vessel. The humans are currently using captured Korthak ships to transport supplies to refugee settlements. They've also established what they call humanitarian corridors to allow safe passage for displaced populations. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. The major powers had spent years debating refugee policies and territorial rights while avoiding direct intervention. These newcomers had solved the problem in 3 days through the simple expedient of overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. "We need to make contact," Prime Minister Jorath declared. "If these humans possess technology and military capabilities that exceed our own, we must determine their intentions regarding the established galactic order." Zethkri activated a holographic display showing a star map of human activities. Contact has already been attempted. The humans have established a diplomatic station in the former Korthak forward base at Kepler 7. They've invited representatives from all galactic governments to discuss what they call humanitarian protocols. Humanitarian protocols? Director Valesh's tentacles curled skeptically. "What does that mean?" "We're not certain, but based on their actions so far, it appears to involve some form of guarantee of protection for civilian populations, particularly refugees and displaced persons. They seem to view the galaxy's current approach to such matters as inadequate." The chamber erupted in protests. The carefully negotiated treaties that governed refugee handling, territorial sovereignty, and military intervention had taken centuries to establish. They represented delicate compromises between competing interests and power blocks. They can't simply ignore established galactic law, Senator Thylin protested. "The sovereignty of member civilizations is the foundation of everything we've built here." Ambassador Zethkri's form flickered with what observers recognized as grim amusement. "Senator, I don't think they're particularly concerned with our opinions on galactic law." When Admiral Torres was asked about territorial sovereignty, she reportedly said that basic sapient rights supersede political boundaries. "And what gives them the authority to make such determinations?" demanded Director Valesh. "Apparently, the fact that they have the military capability to enforce their decisions." The brutal simplicity of this answer silenced the chamber. For all their sophisticated political structures and carefully balanced power arrangements, galactic civilization ultimately operated on the same principle humanity seemed to embrace: might makes right. The difference was that the humans appeared willing to use their might for idealistic, rather than pragmatic purposes. "What do we know about their military capabilities?" Prime Minister Jorath asked quietly. Zethkri's display shifted to show tactical analyses of the recent conflicts. "Preliminary assessments suggest their technology is approximately 50 to 75 years ahead of our current capabilities. Their ships demonstrate superior speed, maneuverability, and firepower. More importantly, they appear to have unlimited logistical support. Our observers haven't seen any supply lines or manufacturing bases, suggesting either advanced automation or resources we haven't detected." "Could we match them if all major powers combined forces?" Senator Thylin asked, unknown. "But even if we could, the question becomes, do we want to start a war with a species that has demonstrated both the capability and willingness to intervene militarily for humanitarian reasons? What would happen to civilian populations caught between our forces and theirs?" It was a sobering question. The humans had established a precedent that civilian casualties were unacceptable. Any military conflict with them would likely involve their efforts to protect non-combatant populations, dramatically complicating traditional warfare strategies. "There's one more thing," Zethkri said. "Intelligence reports suggest this isn't their full military capability. The forces we've observed appear to be a small expeditionary element. References have been made to something called the home fleet that remains in their origin system. The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. If what they'd witnessed was merely a reconnaissance force, what kind of military power did these humans possess in their home territory?" "Recommendations?" Prime Minister Jorath asked. "We attend their diplomatic meetings," Zethkri replied. "We listen to their proposals, and we very carefully avoid giving them any reason to view us as threats to civilian populations." As the assembly broke up into urgent private conferences, one thought dominated every delegate's mind: the galaxy's political order, stable for centuries, was about to change forever. The only question was whether that change would be evolutionary or revolutionary. Outside the council chambers, encrypted messages flashed across the galaxy as each major power began preparing for a new era of interstellar relations. An era where someone was finally willing to back humanitarian ideals with overwhelming force. The galaxy ignored them, then humanity stepped in. The diplomatic station that had once served as a Korthak forward base now buzzed with unprecedented activity. Representatives from across the galaxy gathered in the converted conference facilities, where humanity's newly appointed ambassador, Dr. Elena Vasquez, prepared to address the assembled powers for the first time. Ambassador Zethkri observed the human diplomat with professional curiosity. Unlike the military officers who had conducted the recent operations, Dr. Vasquez appeared remarkably ordinary, middle-aged, soft-spoken, with the kind of academic bearing typical of career diplomats. It was difficult to reconcile this unassuming figure with the species that had just rewritten galactic military dynamics. Before we begin formal discussions, Dr. Vasquez said in fluent galactic standard, I want to address some concerns that have been raised about humanity's intentions in this region. Director Valesh leaned forward in her specialized seating apparatus. Dr. Vasquez, your species has made several statements about humanitarian protocols and civilian protection. Could you clarify what this means in terms of existing territorial sovereignty? The human diplomat smiled with what appeared to be genuine warmth. Director, humanity recognizes that we're newcomers to this galaxy's political structure. We have no desire to disrupt established governments or claim territory. However, we also cannot stand by while innocent populations suffer preventable harm. But who determines what constitutes preventable harm? Pressed Prime Minister Jorath. And by what authority do you make such determinations? Dr. Vasquez's expression became more serious. Prime Minister, let me share something about human history. We've experienced our share of atrocities, genocides, slavery, mass starvation while others prospered. We learned, sometimes the hard way, that looking away from suffering doesn't make it disappear. It just makes us complicit. She activated a holographic display showing images from the recent refugee camps. When we discovered that millions of sapient beings were living in fear, while major galactic powers debated jurisdiction and territorial rights, we had a choice. We could respect your political processes and let the suffering continue, or we could act according to our principles. Senator Thylan's voice carried a note of frustration. But you can't simply impose your values on the entire galaxy. Different species have different approaches to governance and intervention. You're absolutely right, Senator. We're not trying to impose anything. We're offering an alternative. Dr. Vasquez touched her control pad, and the display shifted to show construction activities across multiple systems. Humanity is establishing what we call sanctuary stations, neutral facilities designed to provide emergency shelter, medical care, and basic services to any refugee population, regardless of their species or origin. Director Valesh studied the schematics with growing alarm. These installations appear to have significant defensive capabilities. They do. We've learned that declaring something a neutral zone means nothing without the ability to enforce that neutrality. But these stations aren't military bases, they're hospitals, schools, and temporary housing facilities that happen to be well protected. Ambassador Zethkri recognized the subtle threat beneath the diplomatic language. Dr. Vasquez, are you suggesting that humanity will use military force to protect these installations? Ambassador, I'm stating clearly that any attack on civilian refugees will be met with an immediate and decisive response. We're not interested in conquest or territorial expansion, but we will not allow humanitarian facilities to be targeted by any force for any reason. The assembled delegates exchanged worried glances. The humans were essentially declaring unilateral authority over civilian protection throughout the galaxy, backed by demonstrated military superiority. This is unprecedented, Prime Minister Jorath said carefully. You're creating a new category of protected space without consulting existing authorities. Prime Minister, with respect, existing authorities had their chance to address this problem. The refugee crisis has been escalating for decades while your governments debated procedures and jurisdiction. How many more should have died while waiting for consensus? Dr. Vasquez's words carried an edge that reminded everyone present of humanity's recent military actions. This wasn't a threat exactly, but it was a clear statement of priorities. What about trade routes, economic zones, military staging areas? Director Valesh asked. Your sanctuary stations could disrupt established commercial and security arrangements. We've designed them to enhance rather than disrupt legitimate activities. Humanitarian stations actually stabilize regions by reducing the desperation that fuels piracy and raiding. Healthy, stable populations make better trading partners than refugees struggling to survive. Senator Thielen leaned back in his chair. Dr. Vasquez, let's be direct. What does humanity want from the established galactic powers? The human diplomat was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider her words carefully. Senator, we want what every decent civilization should want. A galaxy where children don't starve while others prosper. Where families aren't torn apart by preventable conflicts. Where basic dignity is extended to every sapient being regardless of their species or political affiliation. That's remarkably idealistic, Ambassador Zethkri observed. Most civilizations pursue more pragmatic interests. Perhaps that's why the galaxy has so many problems, Dr. Vasquez replied mildly. But to address your concern directly, we're not asking anyone to change their government or abandon their interests. We're simply establishing minimum standards for the treatment of civilian populations. And if existing governments disagree with these standards, Prime Minister Jorath asked. Dr. Vasquez's expression didn't change, but something in her tone suggested the diplomacy had limits. Then we hope they'll reconsider. Humanity prefers cooperation to conflict, but we won't compromise on fundamental principles. Director Valesh's tentacles writhed with agitation. You're describing a form of galactic police force answerable only to human leadership. How is that different from conquest? Director, conquerors claim territory and subjugate populations. We're protecting people and asking nothing in return, except that they be treated with basic dignity. The sanctuary stations will be governed by multi-species councils including representatives from every refugee population. Humanity provides security and resources, but not political control. The delegates spent the next several hours reviewing detailed proposals for humanitarian protocols, refugee protection standards, and emergency response procedures. The humans had clearly been planning this initiative for months, with comprehensive solutions for problems the galactic powers had been debating for years. As the session concluded, Ambassador Zethkri found himself privately impressed by the scope and thoughtfulness of humanity's proposals. They weren't the crude ultimatums of a conquering force, but the carefully crafted policies of a species that had apparently spent considerable time studying galactic civilization and its failures. Dr. Vasquez, he said as delegates prepared to leave, may I ask what happens if the major powers reject these proposals? The human diplomat smiled sadly. Ambassador, humanity has already begun implementation. We're not seeking permission, we're offering partnership. The galaxy's governments can choose to work with us to improve conditions for refugee populations, or they can watch from the sidelines while we do it alone. But we won't allow political considerations to delay action on humanitarian crises. As Zethkri departed the station, he realized that the galaxy's established order hadn't just been challenged, it had been bypassed entirely. Humanity wasn't playing by the existing rules, because they'd decided the rules were inadequate. The question now was whether the major powers would adapt to this new reality, or find themselves increasingly irrelevant in a galaxy where someone was finally willing to put principles before politics. The galaxy ignored them. Then humanity stepped in 6 months after the diplomatic meetings at Kepler 7. The galaxy was witnessing changes that no amount of political maneuvering could halt. Captain Veltar stood on the observation deck of the newly constructed Sanctuary Station Alpha, watching as ships from dozens of species brought supplies and refugees to what had become a beacon of hope in the Outer Rim. Hard to believe this was empty space not so long ago, said Dr. Chen, the human medical officer who had become Veltar's unlikely friend during his recovery from Korthak injuries. Veltar's mandibles clicked in agreement. When Captain Sarah Chen first mentioned humans to me, I thought you were just another species passing through our region. I never imagined you would build something like this. The station was a marvel of engineering and humanitarian design. Massive rotating sections provided artificial gravity for dozens of different species, while central cores housed advanced medical facilities, educational centers, and manufacturing capabilities. Most remarkably, the entire complex was administered by a council of elected representatives from every refugee population that had found shelter there. The Galactic Council still hasn't formally recognized the sanctuary stations, Dr. Chen noted, reviewing reports on her handheld device, but their member species keep sending unofficial aid shipments. Veltar laughed. a sound that would have been impossible during his darkest days as a refugee. Official or not, the results speak for themselves. Have you seen the latest population figures? The numbers were staggering. Across 7 major stations and dozens of smaller facilities, humanity had provided shelter, medical care, and educational opportunities to over 50 million refugees. More importantly, they had created sustainable communities where different species worked together on projects that benefited everyone. The Hegemony Council is particularly conflicted, Dr. Chen said, pulling up diplomatic communications. Their latest message congratulates us on innovative approaches to humanitarian challenges, while simultaneously protesting our unauthorized establishment of facilities in neutral space. Politicians, Veltar said dismissively. They're more concerned with maintaining their authority than solving actual problems. A soft chime indicated an incoming priority transmission. Dr. Chen accepted the call, and Captain Sarah Chen's image appeared on the holographic display. Dr. Chen, Captain Veltar, we have a developing situation that requires immediate attention. The Drakmori Empire has launched what they're calling a liberation campaign against the Helix colonies. Early reports suggest civilian populations are being targeted. Veltar felt his scales bristle. The Drakmori were known for their brutal military tactics and their belief that weaker species deserved subjugation. If they were targeting civilian settlements, it would be a massacre. What's the galactic response? Dr. Chen asked. Captain Chen's expression grew grim. The usual. Emergency sessions, calls for restraint, and debates about territorial jurisdiction. The Helix colonies aren't members of any major alliance, so nobody wants to risk conflict with the Drakmori over what they're calling an internal matter. How many civilians are we talking about? Veltar asked, though he dreaded the answer. Approximately 8 million across 12 colonies. Mixed populations. Refugees from previous conflicts who thought they'd found safety in an isolated region. The Drakmori claim the colonies are harboring pirates, but intelligence suggests they're really after the rare mineral deposits in the system. Dr. Chen was already pulling up star charts and logistical data. Distance from our nearest facilities? 4 days at maximum speed. But here's the complication. This is deeper in Galactic Core territory than we've operated before. Any intervention could be seen as humanity expanding its sphere of influence. Veltar watched the humans process this information with the calm efficiency he'd come to associate with their species. Where other civilizations would spend weeks debating political implications, humans focused on practical solutions. Captain, Dr. Chen said carefully, what are your orders? Evacuation protocols full scale. We're not leaving 8 million people to die while politicians debate jurisdiction. Captain, Chen's voice carried the kind of quiet determination that Veltar had learned to recognize as extremely dangerous to humanity's enemies. But this operation is going to send a message to the entire galaxy about how far we're willing to go to protect civilian populations. Within hours, the sanctuary stations transformed into massive coordination centers. Human ships, many of them converted freighters and civilian vessels, began arriving from across the galaxy. But they weren't alone. Veltar was amazed to see ships from dozens of species joining the humanitarian fleet. Captain Veltar, came a familiar voice over the communication system. It was Captain Torres, the human admiral who had defeated the Korthak fleet. We have a proposition for you. Veltar accepted the call eagerly. Admiral, how can I assist? We're putting together a civilian coordination fleet, ships crewed by refugee species who want to help with evacuation operations. These won't be combat vessels, but they'll be essential for transport and logistics. Interested in commanding the Zephyrian contingent? The offer was both an honor and a responsibility that Veltar felt deeply. Admiral, it would be my privilege. Over the next 2 days, Veltar found himself coordinating a fleet of volunteer vessels unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Former refugees who had found new purpose were working alongside humans to prepare for the largest humanitarian operation in galactic history. The Drakmori Empire, meanwhile, had noticed the massive fleet buildup and issued increasingly strident warnings about foreign interference in their territorial expansion. Their diplomatic protests to the Galactic Council grew more desperate as it became clear that humanity intended to proceed, regardless of official objections. The Drakmori are demanding that the galactic powers intervene to stop us, Dr. Chen reported as final preparations continued. They're claiming humanity is using humanitarian pretexts to establish a military presence in their region. What's the Council's response? Veltar asked. Officially, they're calling for all parties to exercise restraint and pursue diplomatic solutions. Unofficially, 3 Council members have quietly provided us with detailed intelligence about Drakmori military positions, and the Galactic Trade Federation has expedited supply shipments to our staging areas. Veltar realized that while the major powers couldn't openly support humanity's intervention due to political constraints, they were clearly hoping someone would finally stand up to the Drakmori Empire's aggressive expansion. Captain, came another transmission from Captain Chen aboard the flagship Defiance. Final briefing in 1 hour. Are your people ready? Veltar looked around the bustling command center where Zephyrians, humans, Arconian, Mendi, and a dozen other species worked together with remarkable efficiency. 6 months ago, these had been desperate refugees with no hope for the future. Now they were an organized force preparing to save others from the same fate they had escaped. We're ready, Captain. All vessels report full operational status and volunteer crews at maximum motivation. As the massive humanitarian fleet prepared to enter hyperspace, Veltar reflected on how much the galaxy had changed since that day the stellar wind had been rescued by a small human ship. The established powers were still debating and politicking, but increasingly they were being bypassed by coalitions of species that had decided to take direct action. The Drakmori Empire was about to learn what the Korthak had discovered, that some lines shouldn't be crossed, and some species wouldn't look away when innocent people needed help. The galaxy ignored them. Then humanity stepped in. 1 year after first contact with humanity, Ambassador Zethkri stood before the Galactic Council in what would be remembered as the most significant session in the organization's history. The crystal chambers, once symbols of established power and careful diplomacy, now seemed antiquated compared to the dynamic changes reshaping galactic civilization. Fellow delegates, Zethkri began, we face a choice that will define the next era of interstellar relations. The humanitarian interventions of the past year have fundamentally altered the balance of power in our galaxy. We can either adapt to these changes or become increasingly irrelevant to the species we claim to govern. The rescue of the Helix colonies had been the turning point. When the combined human refugee fleet had successfully evacuated 8 million civilians while simultaneously dismantling Drakmori military capabilities, the galaxy's major powers had been forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their political processes were being superseded by direct action. Director Valesh activated her holographic displays, showing economic data that painted a stark picture. The Sanctuary Station network now handles more interstellar trade than several of our member civilizations. Their humanitarian infrastructure has become essential to regional stability, making them effectively ungovernable by traditional means. The numbers were undeniable. Humanity's approach of providing security, resources, and infrastructure without demanding political control had created a new model of civilization that attracted species from across the galaxy. Traditional power structures based on territorial control and resource extraction were proving less effective than systems built around mutual aid and voluntary cooperation. The Drakmori situation illustrated our fundamental problem, Prime Minister Jorath noted grimly. While we debated territorial sovereignty and procedural requirements, a humanitarian crisis developed and was resolved without any input from this council. We've become observers in our own galaxy. Senator Thylin leaned forward in his chair. The question is whether we view this as a threat to our authority or an opportunity to improve our approach to governance. It was a question that had split the galactic establishment. Conservative factions viewed humanity as a destabilizing force that threatened the carefully balanced political arrangements that had maintained peace for centuries. Progressive elements saw the humans as proof that their existing systems were inadequate and needed fundamental reform. I've spent considerable time observing human operations, Zethkri said. What I've found challenges many of our assumptions about power and governance. They don't seek to control territory or subjugate populations. Instead, they focus on solving problems and building relationships. Dr. Elena Vasquez entered the chamber, accompanied by Captain Sarah Chen and a diverse group of representatives from species that had benefited from human assistance. The sight of former refugees now serving as diplomatic partners with one of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations was a powerful symbol of changing times. Dr. Vasquez, Director Valesh said formally, the Galactic Council would like to discuss humanity's long-term intentions regarding galactic governance. The human diplomat smiled with the same calm confidence that had become her trademark. Director, humanity has no interest in governing the galaxy. We're focused on establishing minimum standards for the treatment of civilian populations and providing assistance where traditional authorities have proven inadequate, but your actions have effectively created a parallel governmental structure, Prime Minister Jorath protested. The sanctuary stations operate independently of established law. Your humanitarian fleets intervene in sovereign territory without authorization. How is this different from conquest? Captain Chen stepped forward, her military bearing a reminder of humanity's demonstrated capabilities. Prime Minister, conquest involves taking control of populations and resources for the conqueror's benefit. We provide assistance and ask for nothing in return, except that people be treated with basic dignity. Yet you've accumulated significant military and economic power, Senator Thailand observed. What prevents you from using that power for less altruistic purposes? Dr. Vasquez activated a holographic display showing the governance structure of the Sanctuary Station network. Senator, every major decision is made by councils that include representatives from all affected populations. Humanity provides resources and security, but we don't control policy. If these communities decided they no longer wanted our assistance, we would respect that decision. Zethkri studied the organizational charts with growing appreciation for their sophistication. The humans had created a system that provided all the benefits of strong central coordination, while maintaining local autonomy and democratic accountability. It was governance theory that the Council had debated for centuries but never successfully implemented. The fundamental question, Zethkri said, is whether the Galactic Council wants to continue operating as we have, or whether we're willing to learn from humanity's successes. The chamber fell silent as delegates considered the implications. For centuries, galactic civilization had operated on the principle that different species required different approaches to government and law. Humanity had demonstrated that certain universal principles, protection of civilians, basic dignity, mutual aid, could transcend species boundaries. What would you propose? Director Valiesh asked carefully. Dr. Vasquez exchanged glances with her diverse group of advisors. We propose the establishment of universal humanitarian accords, galaxy-wide standards for the treatment of civilian populations, refugee protection, and crisis response. Any civilization that meets these standards would be eligible for mutual defense agreements and economic cooperation. Those that don't would find themselves increasingly isolated. It was an elegant solution that preserved sovereignty while establishing consequences for humanitarian violations. Civilizations could govern themselves as they chose, but those that mistreated their populations or ignored refugee crises would lose access to the growing network of cooperation and trade that humanity had fostered. And enforcement? Prime Minister Jorath asked. Captain Chen's expression grew serious. The same as it's always been. Those willing to stand up for humanitarian principles will protect those who can't protect themselves. The difference is that now there are enough of us to make that protection effective. Over the following weeks, the Galactic Council engaged in the most intensive negotiations in its history. Conservative factions fought to maintain traditional territorial sovereignty, while progressive elements pushed for comprehensive humanitarian reforms. But the debates were largely academic across the galaxy. Individual species were already choosing sides. The Zephyrians, Arconians, Mendi, and dozens of other species that had benefited from human assistance formed the core of what became known as the Humanitarian Alliance. Larger powers like the Stellar Dominion and portions of the Hegemony Council gradually aligned themselves with the new standards, recognizing that isolation from the growing network would be economically and politically costly. 3 months after the crucial council session, Ambassador Zethkri stood once again on the observation deck of Sanctuary Station Alpha, watching as construction crews from a dozen species worked together to expand the facility. The galaxy hadn't been conquered or revolutionized, it had simply evolved toward something better. Any regrets about how things turned out? Asked Captain Veltar. who had become the elected representative of the Zephyrian colonies. Zethacre's crystalline form reflected the lights of the bustling station in shifting patterns. Quite the opposite, my friend. For the first time in centuries, the galaxy feels like it's moving toward something greater than the sum of its parts. Below them, refugee children from dozens of species played together in the station's gardens, while their parents worked on projects that would benefit communities across the galaxy. It wasn't the future anyone had planned, but it was a future where being ignored was no longer a death sentence. Humanity had kept their promise. They had stepped in when the galaxy needed someone to care more about people than politics. And in doing so, they had shown everyone else what was possible when beings chose to act according to their highest principles, rather than their narrowest interests. The galaxy had been changed forever, not through conquest or revolution, but through the simple, radical act of refusing to look away when others suffered. And that, perhaps, was the most human thing of all.